"He's long gone," Lauren said, her voice flat, as if she were commenting on the weather rather than the death of a son. Margaret Hale stood in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, the late afternoon light slanting across the laminate countertop, dust motes hanging in the air like they were waiting for an explanation that never came. She had called to ask a simple question, the kind of question a mother should never have to ask in the first place: what time the funeral would be, when she should arrive, who she should call, what she needed to bring, but the answer stopped her cold. Long gone. The words didn't land all at once. They drifted, slow and unreal, as if they belonged to another conversation, another family, another woman entirely. Margaret said nothing. On the other end of the line, Lauren didn't fill the silence. She didn't soften her tone. She didn't offer details. The call ended with a faint click, and Margaret was left staring at the refrigerator door where a faded photo of Daniel at age 10 was still held up by a souvenir magnet from a beach trip decades ago. She waited for the shock to turn into something louder, something that demanded tears or anger, but instead it settled into a heavy stillness that pressed against her chest. Margaret was 72 years old, a widow for almost 8 years, and she had buried friends, siblings, even her own parents, but nothing in her life had prepared her for the way her son's death was delivered like an afterthought. The house around her felt too quiet, not the peaceful quiet she had grown used to, but a hollow one, the kind that suggested something essential had been removed without warning. She moved to the table and sat down, her hand still curled around the phone, noticing absurd details she would later remember with clarity: the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking wall clock that Daniel had once complained was too loud, the grocery receipt folded neatly beside her purse showing she had spent $46 and change that morning. Somewhere in her mind, a practical part of her noted that if there was no funeral time, there was no funeral plan, and that absence began to feel deliberate. Margaret replayed the conversation, or what little of it there had been, listening. Again for grief in Lauren's voice, for strain or hesitation, but there had been none. Just certainty, just distance. Daniel had married Lauren 12 years earlier, and while Margaret had tried to remain gracious, she had felt herself gradually edged out of her son's life. Holidays shortened, phone calls answered less often, decisions relayed secondhand, as if she were a distant relative instead of the woman who had raised him. Still, Daniel had always found ways to reassure her: quick lunches squeezed into busy weeks, handwritten birthday cards, small gestures that said he remembered where he came from. Now even those memories felt fragile, like something that could be erased if no one else acknowledged them. Margaret rose and walked through the house, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a doorway, grounding herself in the ordinary weight of familiar things. She thought of the last time she had seen Daniel in person, nearly 6 months earlier, how tired he had looked, how Lauren had answered most of the questions directed at him, how he had squeezed his mother's hand before leaving as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the moment. At the sink, Margaret turned on the tap and let the water run, watching it pool and disappear, steady and indifferent. She considered calling the hospital, then hesitated, unsure of what she would even say, unsure of whether she was entitled to ask. The idea that a mother might need permission to mourn her own child made her stomach tighten. She dried her hands carefully and picked up her purse, checking that her driver's license was still inside, that her name was still printed there in black ink, undeniable proof that she existed, that she had a place in the world even if it seemed she had been erased from her son's final chapter. Outside, the late summer air was warm, the kind of day Daniel would have described as perfect for a long drive, and as Margaret locked the door behind her, one clear thought settled in her mind, quiet but firm, that whatever Lauren meant by long gone, the story was not finished, and Margaret was no longer willing to accept silence as an answer. Margaret did not call anyone that evening. She made soup from a can she had bought months ago and barely remembered placing in the pantry, heated it until it bubbled softly, then turned the stove off before finishing half the bowl. The clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, marking seconds that felt strangely disconnected from her life, as if time itself had decided to keep going without consulting her. She sat at the table long after the light outside faded, replaying the past few weeks with a precision that surprised her, noticing small absences she had dismissed at the time. Daniel had not answered her last 2 calls, which she had blamed on work stress. Lauren had sent a short message instead, saying he was resting and would call later. He never did. Margaret had accepted that explanation because accepting it required less effort than questioning it. Now, in the quiet of her house, that effort felt unavoidable. The next morning, she woke before dawn and lay still, listening to the sound of her own breathing. There was no message on her phone, no update, no clarification. She rose, made coffee she barely touched, and opened her notebook where she kept phone numbers written carefully in blue ink. Her hands did not shake when she dialed the hospital Daniel had mentioned months earlier during a brief conversation about tests and appointments. The woman who answered placed her on hold, and Margaret listened to the same soft instrumental loop play again and again, counting how many times it repeated, anchoring herself in something measurable. When the woman returned, her voice shifted slightly as she checked the name. Daniel Hale, 41. A pause. Then another pause, longer this time. The woman said she could not discuss details but confirmed that Daniel had been a patient there and that his records had been closed. Closed was the word she used, not passed away, not deceased, just closed, as if he were a file neatly put away. Margaret thanked her and hung up, her fingers lingering on the phone as if it might speak again on its own. She drove later that morning, the familiar route toward Daniel's neighborhood, feeling unfamiliar without the expectation of seeing him. When she reached the street, she noticed his car was gone. The driveway was empty. Curtains were drawn. Everything looked paused, waiting. She did not knock. Instead, she sat in her car and watched the house, realizing she had no idea whether Lauren still lived there or if everything had already been cleared out. The thought that her son's life could be packed into boxes without her knowing tightened her chest. On the drive home, Margaret stopped at the church she had attended for years, the one where Daniel had been baptized and later confirmed, where his name was etched into memory, if nowhere else. The office was open, and she spoke quietly to the secretary, asking if there had been any notice, any service planned. The woman searched the calendar, then shook her head with a practiced expression of regret. No request had been made. No information received. Margaret nodded, thanked her, and left, feeling something solidify inside her, a recognition that the absence was not accidental. That afternoon, she went through old mail, bills, and cards, lining them up on the table as if order might reveal meaning. She found a birthday card from Daniel sent just 3 months earlier, his handwriting slightly rushed but unmistakable, a brief message telling her he loved her and would visit soon. Soon had never come. She realized then that grief had not arrived the way she expected, not as tears or collapse, but as a slow understanding that she had been deliberately kept outside the final moments of her son's life. That night, Margaret sat by the window as the sun went down, watching headlights pass, each one belonging to someone going somewhere with purpose. Lauren's words returned to her, not with the sting they had carried before, but with a colder clarity. Long gone was not just a description. It was a dismissal, and in that realization, Margaret felt the first shift, subtle but decisive, from waiting to knowing. Margaret began to pay attention to the details she had once ignored. The following days moved slowly, each hour stretching as if the world had lost its urgency, and yet within that slowness she noticed patterns forming. Lauren did not call. She did not send a message. There was no acknowledgement of Margaret's existence beyond that single conversation. It was as if the role of mother had quietly expired along with Daniel, leaving Margaret without a place or a title anyone felt obligated to recognize. On the third day, Margaret drove to the county records office, not with a plan, but with a need to see something official, something grounded in paper and ink. She waited her turn, took a number, and sat between strangers who were there for reasons that felt trivial compared to her own. When she finally reached the counter, she asked, carefully and calmly, whether a death certificate had been filed under her son's name. The clerk typed, paused, then nodded. Yes, it had been filed. Margaret asked when. The clerk told her the date. It was 2 weeks earlier. The number lodged in Margaret's mind like a splinter. 2 weeks. 14 days during which Daniel had been gone, while she was still leaving messages, still setting aside time in her day to wait for a call that would never come. She thanked the clerk and stepped outside, the afternoon sun too bright, the noise of traffic too ordinary for what she had just learned. Sitting in her car, Margaret did the quiet math of realization. Lauren had known. Lauren had known and had chosen not to tell her. That choice echoed backward, recontextualizing every unanswered call, every delayed response, every carefully worded message that now felt rehearsed. Margaret thought of the way Lauren had always managed information, how she framed decisions as practical, how she spoke for Daniel even when he was in the room. At the time, Margaret had told herself it was modern marriage, that couples shared everything, that her role was to step back. Now that restraint felt less like grace and more like permission. That evening, Margaret pulled out a small box she kept in her bedroom closet, one she had not opened in years. Inside were letters Daniel had written in college, postcards from business trips, notes left on the kitchen counter during visits. She read them slowly, hearing his voice in her mind, noting the consistency of his affection, the way he always asked about her health, her routines, her needs. There was nothing in his words that suggested he would have wanted her excluded, erased, informed after the fact. The contrast between those letters and Lauren's single sentence was stark, almost surgical. The next morning, Margaret visited Daniel's old neighbor, a man who used to wave whenever Margaret parked in the driveway during visits. She approached the conversation cautiously, not wanting to appear intrusive, but the man's confusion mirrored her own when she asked about Daniel. He had not seen a funeral procession. He had not heard announcements. He had simply noticed the moving truck one morning and assumed the couple had relocated. Margaret thanked him and walked away, each step reinforcing the same conclusion. There had been no communal grief, no shared acknowledgement, no space for remembrance beyond whatever suited Lauren's plans. Back at home, Margaret sat with her notebook again, this time writing dates, names, fragments of information, not as accusations, but as anchors. She was not looking for confrontation. She was looking for coherence. The more she wrote, the clearer it became that this silence had been constructed, not accidental. Daniel's death had been managed, contained, simplified, reduced to an inconvenience that needed to be resolved efficiently. Margaret closed the notebook and placed it beside her bed, feeling neither rage nor despair, but a steady resolve. She understood now that mourning would not be granted to her by others. It would have to be claimed. And before it could be claimed, the truth would have to be acknowledged, even if she was the only one willing to hold it. As the days passed, Margaret began to look backward, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity, tracing the quiet shift that had taken place years before Daniel's death. She remembered when his visits had grown shorter, when conversations that once lingered over coffee were reduced to polite updates exchanged near the door. At the time, she had attributed it to adulthood, to responsibility, to the natural distance that formed when children built lives of their own. Now those memories rearranged themselves, forming a pattern that no longer felt benign. Lauren had always been present, not loudly, not aggressively, but consistently, guiding schedules, answering questions before Daniel could, reframing decisions as if they had already been agreed upon. Margaret recalled holidays when plans changed at the last minute, explanations delivered smoothly, leaving no room for disagreement without appearing unreasonable. She remembered being told that Daniel was tired, overwhelmed, too busy to talk, and how she had accepted those explanations because accepting them preserved the idea of harmony. Sitting in her living room, Margaret realized that harmony had come at a cost she had not measured at the time. She opened her notebook again, not to add new facts, but to connect old ones, noting dates of canceled visits, missed calls, delayed responses. Each entry felt small on its own, but together they outlined a gradual withdrawal that had been managed with care. Margaret understood then that exclusion rarely arrived. Suddenly, it was constructed slowly, normalized through repetition, until absence felt ordinary. She thought of the last family gathering she had attended, nearly 2 years earlier, when Daniel had looked distracted, his attention divided, his answers brief. Lauren had sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her voice calm as she explained his schedule for him. Margaret had smiled, nodding, telling herself that support looked different in different marriages. Now she questioned whether that support had also functioned as a barrier. The realization did not ignite anger. It produced clarity. Margaret was not grieving only Daniel's death, but the loss of access to him that had occurred long before his life ended. That evening, she sorted through photographs stored in a drawer, images from birthdays, graduations, ordinary afternoons that once seemed insignificant. In the later pictures, Lauren stood closer to Daniel than Margaret did, often positioned between them, not physically blocking, but subtly occupying the space that conversation once flowed through. Margaret noticed how often she herself stood slightly apart, smiling, hands folded, present but peripheral. The photographs had recorded what she had chosen not to see. The next day, Margaret received a piece of mail addressed to Daniel at her home, forwarded automatically after an address change she had never requested. The envelope was thin, official, and unopened. She held it for a long moment before placing it on the table, understanding that even the systems designed to track lives had been adjusted without her knowledge. Someone had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. Margaret did not open the envelope. She did not need its contents to confirm what she already knew. Control had been established quietly, long before grief could complicate it. Later that afternoon, Margaret took a walk through her neighborhood, the familiar sidewalks offering a sense of order. She passed houses where families gathered, voices drifting through open windows, ordinary scenes that underscored what she had been denied. She felt no urge to interrupt them, no resentment toward their normalcy. Instead, she recognized the strength required to maintain appearances while orchestrating silence. Lauren had not needed to be cruel to be effective. She had simply needed to be thorough. When Margaret returned home, she sat down and wrote a single sentence in her notebook, not as an accusation, but as a reminder. This did not begin with his death. Writing it down transformed the thought from suspicion into certainty. Margaret closed the notebook and placed it back in its drawer, aware that understanding the past was not an end in itself. It was preparation. Whatever came next would require patience, restraint, and an unwavering commitment to the truth as she now saw it. Margaret was no longer searching for explanations. She was assembling context. And with each memory re-examined, she felt herself moving from the margins of her own story back toward its center. By the end of the week, Margaret understood that facts alone would not surface on their own. Silence had been maintained because no one had challenged it, and the absence of resistance had allowed it to harden into something permanent. On the 6th morning after her call with Lauren, Margaret received a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. The voice belonged to a woman who introduced herself as Elaine, speaking carefully, as if choosing each word carried weight. She said she had been Daniel's hospice nurse during the final days, and that she had been trying to reach Margaret since learning her contact information had been removed from the file. The message was brief and cautious, ending with an offer to talk if Margaret wished. Margaret listened to it twice before sitting down, her hand resting flat on the table. This was the first time someone had acknowledged her absence as an error rather than a preference. When Margaret returned the call, Elaine's tone softened, relief evident even through professional restraint. She explained that Daniel had asked about his mother more than once, that he had assumed Margaret had been informed, that the staff had been told all communication was to go through his wife. Elaine did not assign blame. She did not speculate. She simply described procedures, how instructions were followed, how files were updated, how names disappeared from lists without explanation. Margaret thanked her, listening without interruption, absorbing the confirmation she had not asked for but needed. After the call ended, Margaret sat quietly, letting the room settle around her. The information did not shatter her. It aligned with what she had already pieced together. Lauren had not only controlled the narrative after Daniel's death, she had shaped it while he was still alive. That afternoon, Margaret drove to the small park where Daniel used to take his lunch breaks when he worked nearby. She sat on a bench, watching people pass, remembering the ease with which he once spoke about his day, his plans, his hopes. She wondered how much of that had been filtered, delayed, or redirected. She wondered when her presence had become inconvenient. The thought was painful, but it was no longer paralyzing. It clarified the path ahead. Margaret knew now that whatever action she took would need to be deliberate and precise. There would be no emotional appeals, no confrontations fueled by grief. Lauren's strength had been efficiency and control, and Margaret understood that matching force with force would fail. Instead, she began to gather documents, quietly requesting copies of records she was legally entitled to, filing forms with steady hands. She visited the county office again, asking procedural questions that sounded ordinary but were anything but. She learned which requests left paper trails and which did not. She learned how timelines were established and how easily they could be overlooked if no one insisted on review. At home, she organized everything into folders, labeling them with dates rather than emotions. Each piece of information reinforced the same conclusion. Lauren had relied on Margaret's distance, on her restraint, on the assumption that she would not press. That assumption had been accurate until now. Margaret did not feel triumphant. She felt resolved. In the quiet evenings, she thought of Daniel, not as he was at the end, but as the man who trusted systems, who believed that people would act reasonably if left alone. That trust had been misplaced, and Margaret accepted that protecting his memory now required a different approach. She did not intend to punish. She intended to correct. One evening, as the sun set behind her house, Margaret placed the final document into its folder and closed it. She did not rehearse conversations. She did not imagine outcomes. She understood that the process ahead would be slow, and that silence would likely continue. But silence no longer intimidated her. It had become familiar terrain. Lauren might believe the matter settled, the story closed, the past managed efficiently. Margaret knew better. She had learned how easily truths could be hidden, and how powerful they became once uncovered. The absence that once made her feel erased now marked the space where her next steps would begin. Margaret moved forward quietly, not because she feared being noticed, but because she understood the value of appearing unchanged. She continued her routines, grocery shopping on the same mornings, attending the same church services, answering polite questions from acquaintances with measured, neutral responses. She did not mention Daniel unless asked, and even then, she spoke with a calm that discouraged further inquiry. This was not denial. It was discipline. Behind that calm, she observed. She noticed how Lauren's name appeared on official correspondence that should have included hers. She noted how accounts had been consolidated, how addresses had been updated, how notifications had been redirected. Each detail confirmed that decisions had been made swiftly and comprehensively, with little regard for anyone outside the immediate circle Lauren controlled. Margaret requested a copy of Daniel's medical authorization forms and read them carefully, line by line, recognizing the signature at the bottom, his handwriting unmistakable, but also recognizing the limitations embedded in the document. Authority had been granted broadly, but not absolutely. There were conditions. There were assumptions. Margaret understood then that Lauren's confidence rested on the belief that no one would examine those boundaries closely. Margaret scheduled a consultation with an estate attorney, choosing one recommended by a neighbor rather than anyone connected to Daniel's past arrangements. She arrived early, carrying her folders neatly stacked, her posture composed. She listened more than she spoke, allowing the attorney to outline general procedures before asking specific questions that revealed her awareness of nuance. She did not accuse. She did not speculate. She simply asked what rights a parent retained when excluded from final decisions, what obligations existed regarding notification, what remedies were available when information had been deliberately withheld. The attorney answered carefully, emphasizing processes, timelines, and documentation. Margaret took notes, not because she needed reminders, but because writing anchored her intent. When she left the office, she felt no rush of satisfaction, only confirmation that her approach was sound. That afternoon, Margaret reviewed Daniel's old emails stored on a backup drive he had given her years earlier, searching not for revelations, but for continuity. She found messages sent during his illness that spoke of future plans, of unfinished conversations, of trust placed in people he believed would act responsibly. There was no indication he intended his mother to be excluded. There was no farewell directed only to his wife. The absence of such messages was as telling as any explicit statement. Margaret closed the laptop and sat quietly, allowing the weight of responsibility to settle. This was not about reclaiming control. It was about restoring accuracy. In the days that followed, Margaret made additional inquiries, each one modest on its own, but cumulative in effect. She requested an itemized statement related to Daniel's care, citing familial interest. She asked the hospital for clarification on communication protocols, framing her questions as procedural rather than personal. She documented responses meticulously, noting delays, inconsistencies, and language that suggested assumptions rather than facts. She did not contact Lauren. That silence was intentional. Margaret understood that confrontation would only invite defensiveness, and defensiveness would complicate matters prematurely. Instead, she allowed Lauren to remain unaware of the scrutiny building quietly around her actions. Margaret reflected often on the irony of the situation, that she had spent years avoiding intrusion in her son's marriage out of respect, only to find that respect had been interpreted as absence. She did not regret her restraint. She recognized it as part of who she was. But she also recognized that restraint did not require passivity. One evening, as Margaret organized her papers, she paused at a photograph of Daniel taken shortly after his wedding. He looked hopeful, confident, unaware of the subtle dynamics that would later shape his final months. Margaret studied his expression and felt a steady resolve strengthen within her. She would not rewrite history. She would not dramatize events. She would ensure that the record reflected what had occurred, without embellishment or omission. The path ahead was clear, even if it was not simple. Margaret closed the folder, labeled it with the date, and placed it beside the others. The structure she was building was quiet, methodical, and firm. Lauren had managed information efficiently, assuming no one would question the outcome. Margaret was not interested in outcomes. She was interested in process. And process, she had learned, was where truth could still be found. Margaret noticed the first sign of resistance in the smallest of ways, a delayed response to a routine request, a polite but cautious tone replacing the efficient certainty she had encountered before. The hospital administration replied to her inquiry with language that was careful, almost guarded, asking for clarification on her relationship to Daniel despite the documentation she had already provided. Margaret responded promptly, attaching copies of records she had prepared in advance, her message concise and unemotional. She understood that hesitation often emerged when assumptions were challenged, and she recognized that her quiet persistence was beginning to disrupt the narrative that had relied on her absence. Days later, a letter arrived addressed to her by name, acknowledging her status formally and outlining next steps in neutral terms. Margaret placed the letter beside her growing stack of papers, noting the shift without satisfaction or surprise. This was how systems corrected themselves, slowly, when compelled by accuracy rather than emotion. Around this time, Lauren finally reached out, leaving a voicemail that sounded composed but strained, asking Margaret to call her back to discuss administrative matters. The message contained no apology, no acknowledgement of omission, only a subtle attempt to reassert control through tone and timing. Margaret listened once, then set the phone down. She did not return the call. She understood that responding now would change the balance she had carefully maintained. Instead, she continued to follow procedure, allowing official channels to speak where personal ones had failed. In the quiet that followed, Margaret reflected on how easily politeness could be used as a shield, how civility could obscure intention. She had practiced both for most of her life, believing they were signs of respect. Now she saw them as tools, neither good nor bad, but powerful when used deliberately. Margaret spent her evenings reviewing timelines, aligning dates from medical records with communications she had received, identifying gaps that could not be explained by oversight alone. Each inconsistency reinforced her understanding that silence had been curated. She did not feel anger toward Lauren. What she felt was distance, the kind that emerges when familiarity dissolves into clarity. Lauren was no longer a daughter-in-law navigating grief. She was an administrator of outcomes, efficient and decisive, accustomed to acting without scrutiny. Margaret recognized this not as malice, but as habit. That distinction mattered. It allowed Margaret to proceed without moral judgment, focusing instead on correction. One afternoon, Margaret visited the cemetery where Daniel's remains had been interred, information she had obtained through official channels rather than family communication. There was no marker yet, only a temporary sign, understated and impersonal. Margaret stood there briefly, noting the absence of ceremony, the lack of witnesses. She did not cry. She placed her hand against the cool air and acknowledged the reality she had been denied. This, too, was part of the record. When she returned home, Margaret drafted a formal request for documentation related to the disposition arrangements, citing her legal interest as next of kin. She mailed it the same day, tracking the delivery, understanding that paper created accountability in ways conversation did not. As the week progressed, Margaret received confirmation that her requests were being processed. Each response was courteous, procedural, devoid of sentiment. She appreciated that. Emotion had complicated matters enough. In the midst of this, Margaret found herself sleeping more soundly than she had since Daniel's death. The clarity of purpose had steadied her. She was no longer waiting for permission to grieve or to act. She was simply doing what needed to be done. The sense of invisibility that had once unsettled her was replaced by a quiet presence, felt rather than announced. Lauren's silence continued, punctuated only by occasional administrative notices that now included Margaret's name alongside hers. The inclusion was subtle, but unmistakable. Margaret understood that this was not victory. It was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, she had learned, was the foundation upon which truth could stand. As she organized the latest documents into her folders, Margaret felt a calm assurance settle in. She did not know how Lauren would respond when the full scope of the review became clear. She did not speculate. She knew only that the story as it had been managed was no longer intact. The process was underway, guided by facts, sustained by patience. Margaret closed her folder and placed it carefully on the shelf, aware that she had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer reacting to what had been withheld from her. She was shaping what would be known. The shift became undeniable when the paperwork stopped treating Margaret as an afterthought and began recognizing her as a participant. Official letters now arrived addressed to both names, phrased carefully, neutral in tone, but altered in structure. Margaret noticed how language changed when accuracy replaced assumption. Phrases that once implied sole authority were revised to reflect shared standing, and questions that had previously been routed exclusively through Lauren were now directed to Margaret as well. She responded to each inquiry with the same measured clarity, providing documentation when required and declining to speculate when it was not. Her goal was not to overwhelm the process, but to steady it. Lauren's silence grew longer, punctuated only by formal notices that carried no personal message. Margaret understood that this was not restraint. It was recalibration. Systems that had once flowed smoothly under a single direction were adjusting to the presence of scrutiny, and that adjustment required time. Margaret continued her routine, attending appointments, keeping her home orderly, maintaining the outward rhythm of her life. Friends who asked about Daniel received factual answers delivered without elaboration. She did not share her progress. She had learned that information, once released, could be reshaped. This was not secrecy. It was care. One afternoon, Margaret received a copy of an amended record, a small but significant correction that acknowledged a delay in notification and cited administrative oversight without naming intent. Margaret read it twice, understanding its importance. The language was cautious, but it marked the first official recognition that something had gone wrong. She filed the document carefully, aware that acknowledgement often preceded accountability, even if indirectly. That evening, she received a second voicemail from Lauren, shorter than the first, more tentative, suggesting a meeting to resolve matters amicably. Margaret deleted it without listening to the end. She did not feel satisfaction in doing so. She felt certainty. Any conversation now would serve to contain the process, not clarify it. Margaret had no interest in containment. She wanted the record complete. Days later, she was contacted by the funeral home, a polite inquiry confirming details that had previously been assumed. The director apologized for the confusion and asked whether Margaret wished to be involved in decisions regarding a permanent marker. Margaret answered calmly, stating that she did, and provided her preferences in writing. When the confirmation arrived, listing her alongside Lauren, Margaret noted the balance without comment. This was how inclusion occurred, not through confrontation, but through insistence on presence. Margaret spent an afternoon at home reviewing everything she had gathered, laying the documents out across the dining table. There were no dramatic revelations, no singular moment of exposure. Instead, there was coherence. Dates aligned. Decisions traced back to specific authorizations. Omissions revealed patterns. The story that emerged was not one of chaos, but of efficiency prioritized over humanity. Margaret understood that such efficiency was often praised, even rewarded, but it carried consequences when left unchecked. She did not assign motive beyond what the facts supported. She did not need to. The structure spoke for itself. That night, Margaret slept deeply, undisturbed by the questions that had once kept her awake. She woke with a sense of quiet resolve, aware that the process had reached a point where it could not simply be reversed or ignored. The next morning, she mailed a final packet of documentation to the appropriate office, including a cover letter that outlined discrepancies plainly, without accusation. She did not request action. She requested review. That distinction mattered. Review implied openness. Action implied demand. Margaret trusted the former more than the latter. As the days passed, responses arrived confirming receipt, acknowledging the need for further examination. None promised outcomes. Margaret did not require them to. She had already achieved what she sought. The narrative that excluded her had been disrupted. Her role as Daniel's mother had been restored within the record, even if it could not be restored in memory. Margaret stood at her kitchen window one evening, watching the sky dim, reflecting on how easily silence had once made her feel powerless. Now silence felt different. It was no longer imposed. It was chosen. Lauren's absence from communication no longer signaled control. It signaled uncertainty. Margaret recognized that uncertainty as a necessary stage, one that preceded adjustment. She did not anticipate apology. She did not seek reconciliation. She sought accuracy. And as she placed the final document into its folder and closed it, Margaret understood that whatever followed would unfold without her needing to raise her voice. The truth, once acknowledged, had a way of continuing on its own. The resolution did not arrive with an announcement or a confrontation. It arrived quietly, through correspondence and confirmations that accumulated until the absence that once defined Margaret's position could no longer be sustained. One morning, she received a formal notice acknowledging a review of procedures related to Daniel's final arrangements, written in language that was careful but unmistakable. It stated that notification protocols had not been followed as intended, and that records would be amended to reflect full familial status. Margaret read the notice once, then placed it beside her other documents without reaction. This was not vindication. It was correction. That afternoon, she received an updated certificate listing her name accurately, not as an afterthought, but as a recognized parent. Holding it, Margaret felt no surge of triumph. She felt relief, the kind that settles slowly when something misaligned is finally set straight. Days later, the cemetery contacted her to confirm the installation date for Daniel's permanent marker, asking if she wished to attend. Margaret agreed, not because attendance felt necessary, but because presence mattered. On the morning of the installation, she arrived alone, the air cool and still. The stone was simple, understated, bearing Daniel's name and dates without embellishment. Margaret stood for a moment, acknowledging the permanence of it, the finality that had once been denied her. She placed her hand near the marker, not touching it, and allowed herself a brief, private acknowledgement of loss. There were no words spoken aloud. None were required. When she returned home, Margaret found an email from Lauren waiting in her inbox. It was longer than previous messages, measured in tone, proposing a conversation to clear misunderstandings and move forward. Margaret read it carefully, noting what it did and did not say. There was concern for process, for resolution, for closure, but no reference to exclusion, no recognition of harm. Margaret did not respond immediately. She understood that closure meant different things to different people. For Lauren, it appeared to mean containment. For Margaret, it meant accuracy. Later that evening, Margaret composed a brief reply. She thanked Lauren for reaching out and stated that the necessary matters were now being handled through appropriate channels. She wished her well and did not propose a meeting. The message was polite, complete, and final. After sending it, Margaret felt no anticipation of response. The outcome no longer depended on dialogue. In the weeks that followed, the official review concluded without fanfare. The findings were procedural, the language restrained, but the implications were clear. Margaret's exclusion had been noted, documented, and corrected within the record. No further action was recommended. Margaret accepted that. She had not sought punishment. She had sought acknowledgement. Friends noticed a change in her, not dramatic, but steady. She spoke of Daniel without hesitation now, sharing memories when asked, no longer guarded by the fear of intrusion. Her grief had found its place, not erased, but integrated. One afternoon, Margaret reorganized her home office, removing the folders from the dining table and placing them neatly on a shelf. She kept them, not as evidence to wield, but as reminders of what persistence without spectacle could accomplish. The quiet authority she had cultivated remained with her, informing how she moved through the world. She understood now that dignity did not require silence, only intention. Months later, Margaret passed Lauren by chance at a grocery store, a brief encounter marked by polite nods and distance. There was no exchange beyond acknowledgement. Margaret felt no need for more. The space between them reflected clarity rather than avoidance. Driving home, Margaret considered how easily she had once been dismissed, and how that dismissal had underestimated her capacity for resolve. She did not dwell on it. She focused instead on the life she continued to live, measured, attentive, grounded. That evening, as she watched the sun set from her kitchen window, Margaret reflected on the arc of events not with bitterness, but with understanding. She had learned that presence could be reclaimed, that truth did not require volume, and that correction, when pursued with patience, carried its own quiet force. The story that had once been managed without her had been reopened, not rewritten, but completed. And in that completion, Margaret found not revenge, but peace.